In 1977, there was a battle royale between two men with high profiles and big egos, British broadcaster David Frost and the recently deposed American President Richard Nixon. Now, that's from Peter Morgan's play Frost Nixon, which was turned into a hit movie some years back. The play is about to be staged in New Zealand for the first time by New Auckland theatre company, Point Blank Productions. I spoke to the two stars of the show, Karl Buckley, who's playing Richard Nixon, and Stephen Lunt, who portrays David Frost. Karl, I was curious to know what you knew of Nixon, of this Frost-Nixon debate before you started working on the play.
Well, I'd seen the film, but that kind of time in history was really interesting. I've always found it really interesting, that the kind of total, almost social breakdown that was happening in America late 60s and through the 70s. And, seeing people do impressions of Richard Nixon as well. So that was something that we tried to steer away from, doing the Richard Nixon impersonation.
Yes, I wondered about that. That's a problem in a way when you play a real person and one who, as you say, has been fictionalised and satirised and characterised. I mean, I guess you have to, as an actor, you have to make him real, don't you?
Yeah, that's one of the huge challenges is we're condensing. Well, I guess the earliest thing that happens in the play is Nixon's resignation, and the play starts with Nixon's resignation, and then it kind of spans 3 years, and so you're condensing all the interviews and all the. The interviews themselves, there was about 28 hours of footage taken. So condensing that down so it makes a dramatic story into essentially 2 hours, along with all the other parts of the story, because the interviews actually don't kick in till interval. So the first half is all build up and establishing characters and kind of putting the challenge that David Frost had ahead of him in perspective.
Well, Stephen, you'll have known, obviously, being a Brit, David Frost, great reputation. You'd argue that this really made his reputation. But having grown up with David Frost, does that make it easier or harder for you, in a way, as an actor, to stamp your own mark on this character?
Yeah, it does make it slightly harder. I mean, I try not to do an impersonation, trying to take some of his quirks and introduce them, especially the accent as well, so that people do recognise David Frost in the performance, but not kind of to be David Frost, just kind of to create a character with David Frost in mind. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't quite young enough for the well, should I say young enough? Yeah, for David Frost and his interviews, the actual his show that he had. But I do remember him in Through the Keyhole with Lloyd Grossman, and showing you around celebrities' houses. That's kind of when I was first introduced to David Frost. So he was a bit older by that point. But yeah, I do remember him, and he is kind of a British icon, really, and especially for the way he kind of came back into the limelight after the interviews.
It was sort of the making of him in some ways, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, he was kind of, he had his show in London and Australia, but they weren't doing particularly well, and he hadn't done. He had a show in America which lost syndication, so it got cancelled. But he always wanted to get back into America, and this is the way he did it. So back into the limelight, as one of the lines in the play says.
And I mean, Nixon had plenty of limelight, Karl, but in terms of your approach to him, this could be seen as David and Goliath, villain hero. Who's your Nixon?
Well, we actually have spent quite a lot of time talking about that. It would have been very easy to do the David Frost, the hero, slaying the Nixon dragon, but we've approached him slightly differently, looked upon Nixon more as a tragic figure. Both of the main characters in their own ways were looking for an opportunity to redeem themselves. Frost to get back into America and back on American screens, and obviously Nixon he'd resigned the presidency, but he wanted to get back into the Washington scene and be part of the whole political system again. He felt that there was work still to be done. We've kind of brought out a bit of a tragic Nixon, which actually plays really well because it's kind of two dogs struggling over the goal of trying to get back into the limelight.
So does your Frost have some sympathy for this Nixon?
Oh,
Stephen?
yeah, he does, especially later on. He has his goal of getting back into the limelight as well, but Frost is quite a sad character as well in the play. I'd say they have a lot of similarities, which is great in the fact that you think that Frost is the hero and Nixon is the villain beforehand, but then you start to realise that they are quite similar and want the same things. Especially after the interviews when Frost has got what he needed from the interviews, he does feel very sorry for Nixon by the end of the show. And I would say it's probably not even a good ending, as it were. I mean, it's a good ending for a play, but for Frost getting what he wants, you kind of feel sorry for Frost as well, because it seems empty, really. Because they both wanted the same thing, but Frost was the only one who got there, and you think, well, what does that mean? You've ruined someone's career to get there. It must feel very empty for Frost at that point.
Do you get the sense, Karl, that Nixon or his advisors chose David Frost because they thought he would be a heck of a lot easier than those, especially those trenchant American journalists who were just falling over themselves, weren't they, to get these interviews? These were the interviews that everybody wanted.
Yeah, Mike Wallace was keen to get an interview with Nixon and keen to pay substantially for it as well. And when Frost came in and out of his own pocketbook gave a couple of $100,000 more, he annoyed a lot of people, and then so that poisoned Frost in terms of the American media. Lots of people didn't want to have anything to do with him. In fact, there was an interview between Mike Wallace and David Frost where Mike Wallace criticised David Frost for buying the Nixon interview when he was prepared to do exactly the same thing, but just wasn't as successful.
Checkbook journalism, eh?
Yeah.
Still a bone of contention.
Absolutely.
In terms of the intensity of this, guys, I mean, you know each other, you've worked in other plays together, but in the second half where these interviews start, I mean, that feels like something that would be really quite exhausting because you're inside the heads of these guys and it's a war. I mean, it's a battle there. What is that like for you, just trying to capture that electricity night after night, I guess it's going to be?
Yeah, I mean, from Frost's point of view, it's him trying desperately, but not having been prepared enough, and then just being railroaded by Nixon completely, and having to go back and get the help of other people to actually get the confidence and the knowledge in order to really nail Nixon and at the end of the interviews. But it is those interviews are quite intense, and they've been amazingly written. So Nixon doesn't. I mean, he railroads Frost, but in a very clever way. Because I mean, Nixon came from a lawyer's background, so knows how to play people and how to to get one over on them, and he definitely does for most of the interviews. So for most of them, Frost doesn't really get a word in edgeways. He asks a question and then it just gets diverted into something else. But yeah, it gets very interesting by the last interview where they really are kind of equals, and it's kind of 50-50 who's going to actually come out on top by the end. So yeah, it's intense stuff, and it's quite gripping.
Well, that's the thing to remember, isn't it? That Nixon was a very intelligent man, had years in the presidency, was used to dealing with the media. So you had two men, intelligent, motivated, understanding the media from their different perspectives. It was an equal match eventually, wasn't it, at least?
Yeah, I mean, Nixon from his lawyer's background, and then Frost from he to quote another line in the play, understood television. He understood how to get what he wanted through the lens of the camera without actually looking through it. It
was a mega television event, wasn't it? Something like 45 million people watched them.
Yeah. It was the biggest news interview that's ever been aired. Had the biggest viewing. Nothing else has ever beaten that since. So yeah, it was huge interviews.
Karl Buckley and Stephen Lunt. Frost Nixon opens on Anzac Day at TheatreWorks Theatre in Birkenhead.